Sometimes I've looked at organisations and I've thought, why are you so into this? And then afterwards somebody drops me a note and says, oh, their head of HR has a trans child. And that person is the person who has cascaded policies through the whole institution without anybody noticing. But the thing is, once you've done it, undoing it means admitting you were wrong. And in that case, it means admitting liability. And it means really angering people that you have said to them it's their right to do something.
Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working. Hi, everybody. So today we're going to look at the fallout from the UK Supreme Court ruling, which said that trans women are definitely not women in the eyes of the law, and sex means biological sex. So we'll consider two aspects of this today. First, we'll look at how employers have reacted to the ruling. And second, we'll provide analysis from an HR perspective about what is going on behind the scenes and why we're seeing such a broad range of responses, including some which are frankly pretty baffling. Are the organisations who are getting it wrong captured, conflicted, or just plain clueless? To help us dig into this, I'm joined by two fabulous guests. So first, we've got Helen Joyce, who's the Director of Advocacy at the human rights charity Sex Matters. Helen, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
Our second guest is Inji Duducu, who's an HR director with 30 years of experience across high street retail and banking in the UK. Hi, Inji. You're speaking to us in a personal capacity today, is that right?
I am, that's right. Thanks for having me on, Tanya.
Helen, if you have any thoughts on what Inji's saying, maybe you could just jot them down. It would be good to get you to sort of chip in as well. I don't know how often you've had a chance to grill an HR director. Sorry, Inji, you're on.
Never.
Oh, Lord.
Poor Inji. Thank you so much for doing this, Inji. Really appreciate it. So listen, we're going to start with Helen. Can you just remind us exactly what the Supreme Court ruling said and why it was so significant, or at least should have been, for employers particularly?
Sure. So this is actually a very long-running legal battle that started in Scotland but ended up at the Supreme Court. Basically, some years ago, the Scottish government decided that it was going to do what's called a positive action measure. And that particular measure was about getting more women onto public boards. But they said that a woman, for that purpose, was anyone who identified as a woman. A grassroots group called For Women Scotland brought them to court and won. And instead of going back and replacing this idea of woman as anyone who identifies as a woman with actual biology, the Scottish government decided to replace it with woman is anyone who has a piece of government paper, official paper, saying that they're a woman. And that could be a gender recognition certificate, which you can get if you're a man to recognise that you have the legal gender of a woman for some purposes legally. So For Women Scotland went back to court, and this time they lost. In the fullness of time, because they appealed, they ended up in the Supreme Court last November, and then in April the Supreme Court handed down a ruling. It was a unanimous ruling, and what it said was that for the purposes of the Equality Act, which is the overarching anti-discrimination law that covers employment and the provision of goods and services and some other stuff, woman means biology. It doesn't mean paperwork, and it certainly doesn't mean gender self-ID. And that's very significant because this is the law that sets out when it is lawful or unlawful to discriminate on the basis of sex. Obviously, it's not lawful in things like, you can't advertise for an accountant and say, I only want a man, but you can advertise for a woman for, say, a bra fitting job or to do cervical smear tests. And you absolutely can discriminate on the basis of sex in a wide range of ordinary situations, for example, toilets and changing rooms, as well as specialist services like domestic violence refuges. So this was pretty significant, but the most significant thing about it, I would say, is the reasoning the Supreme Court gave. It did say that this was just about the Equality Act, but it said how you decide when a gender recognition certificate changes someone's sex for the purposes of other laws. So I won't go into the technical details, but basically what it said is when the purpose of another law requires you to think about bodies, not paperwork, and when other people's rights are in play, then it is highly likely the law means biology, not paperwork. So for pensions and marriage certificates, it's fine that it's paperwork, but for things like, say, police searching or what it means to commit sex by deception, it's going to be bodies. And those aren't things that are in the Equality Act, but the reasoning will apply to those too.
Okay, and that ruling came out on the 16th of April, I think. How did you kind of hope or expect employers to respond, and what actually happened?
I don't think we thought that a win would be responded to the way it was. I think we thought like, wow, if we win, we're kind of done because the Supreme Court is the law. Like when the Supreme Court speaks, it's not just that it makes the law, it's that it makes the law as it always was. That's the doctrine in this country. When the Supreme Court said at 10 a.m. on the 16th of April that in the Equality Act, sex meant sex, not paperwork, that was true from 2010 when the Equality Act was passed. It acted retroactively. Every policy back to 2010 that said otherwise was unlawful. Obviously, you weren't going to be sued for them, but like at that clapper moment, at that second, anyone who wasn't in line with that should have understood they were now suddenly unlawful. It did not happen that way, Tanya, to say the least.
Yes, I think that's what we've seen. So, I mean, it's fair to say that there have been a range of responses from employers, which I've grouped into 4 categories. So I'll just run through those quickly and get your thoughts on them. The first group is the ones who've just made no public response at all. I think they're by far the biggest group. They've just been completely silent, so we don't really know what's going on behind the scenes there. The second group of employers are the ones who seem to have acknowledged the Supreme Court ruling, but at the same time said they're waiting for further guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So for me, they seem to be kind of riding 2 horses there. The third group is the group who's made a clear and decisive statement that they've understood what the ruling means and immediately actioned that in terms of their policies. So the most high-profile example is Barclays Bank, whose chief executive said, following the Supreme Court ruling, we believe that we have to comply with that by not allowing trans women to use female bathrooms. We strive in every way to make the appropriate facilities available in a comfortable way for people to use and to provide equality of opportunities and development. It was quite interesting to see that Barclays had clearly made their decision and they were not going to bow to pressure or budge on that. So, in fact, they actually pulled out of sponsoring Pride in Liverpool over the issue, presumably because they didn't appreciate the organisers of that event asking them to break the law and donate money to the event, which seems kind of fair enough to me. So that's the first 3 groups. The fourth and final group are the employers who published what looked like kind of allyship statements, expressing solidarity with their trans-identifying colleagues. I mean, those are generally more like sort of internal comms, or they were posted on kind of internal messaging boards and things like that. They weren't official statements as far as I can see. And it's also unclear how they plan to move forward, but it sort of looks like they're kind of openly rejecting or at least kind of showing some kind of disdain for the Supreme Court ruling for now, which seems rather odd to me as it is actually like the law. I think a good example of that is the supermarket chain Co-op, whose chief exec wrote a letter to her staff extending, this is a quote, personal support to all of our trans and non-binary colleagues, those with trans and non-binary loved ones, and anyone who will be feeling the impact of the ruling. And she also vowed to, in quotes, protect trans people to the end. I don't think she acknowledged the possibility that any of her staff might actually be quite happy about the ruling. Helen, what are your reflections on the responses of employers overall, and what seem to be the main points of confusion for them, and where do you think those have come from?
Sure. So the first thing to say is that a lot of small employers especially just aren't that familiar with the law. They're just pottering along and not expecting anything terrible to happen to them. But then that's no excuse, obviously, for a large company. But the thing is that ever since 2010, the advice that's been given on the Equality Act has been wrong. And I don't just mean wrong according to what the Supreme Court says now, I mean wrong according to what was understood before as well. Because quite a lot of lobby groups, Stonewall chief among them, have presented it as the law that you have to accept people as male or female by what they say they are. And we've never had gender self-ID in this country. The government considered introducing it in 2018 under Theresa May, but it didn't. So it has never been the law that a man who just says he's a woman must count as a woman in any sense in equality and anti-discrimination law. But lobby groups told companies that it was true. They said trans women are women, no debate. If you said otherwise, you got called a bigot. People lost their jobs over this. And so a lot of people, were going in with the wrong lens to the Supreme Court ruling. That judgment was solely about the people who have gender recognition certificates. It was nothing to do with people who don't. So if you went in thinking that the gender self-ID was the law in this country, you won't be able to read and understand the ruling. It'll literally make no sense to you. It's like you're looking through the wrong end of a telescope. So I think that's been a lot of the source of confusion. And then the second thing is that there have been some really bizarre but very clever bits of misinformation put out by people who don't like the ruling and are hoping to overturn it. So one of them is the thing that I said, that the law hasn't changed. That's axiomatic with any Supreme Court ruling. As I said, the Supreme Court says what the law always was. Even if other people were interpreting it differently, the other people were wrong back in the past. It rewrites the past in a way. So people are saying, well, the law hasn't changed. And people are hearing that as what I thought was the law is still the law. So we're seeing that over and over and over again. And then another thing that's been seized on is one of the remarks that the president of the court, Lord Hodge, who gave the remarks when the judgment was handed down, he said he cautioned against understanding this ruling as, I think it was a triumph of one group over another. Now, if you understand equality law, you understand that's a remark about the people with protected characteristics. That's what groups means in the Equality Act. So what he was saying is there is no hierarchy of protected characteristics. But this was misrepresented as, we caution the winners of this case not to act like they were winners. So obviously we were happy. We just won a Supreme Court case, and it was a real David and Goliath battle as well. It was literally grassroots groups for Women's Scotland, the Lesbian Interveners, and Sex Matters, which is a teeny tiny, very new charity, up against the Scottish Government, the Equalities Regulator, and Amnesty. So real David and Goliath stuff, and we won. We're entitled to feel happy about it. We came out and we cheered and we cried and we popped champagne corks. And then people started saying that we were triumphalist and that this was very unseemly and we should be thinking about the people who mind and so on. Like I had radio interviews the next day that started with, can't you see how hard this is for trans people? And I said, can we stop and say how wonderful it is for the half of humanity that's female first, please? Like, okay, fine, we have to think about that too. But can we start by saying that this judgment was in order to protect women's rights? If you read it, it's 88 pages of clarity about the importance of protecting women's rights. So there was a lot of disinformation. I would say as well that the response that you mentioned for Barclays indicates that people who have done precisely what the trans lobby wanted them to do for the last decade and more knew very well that if they changed course, they would get attacked. And what they wanted to do was not be the first. So businesses are acting like that. They're all hoping that someone else will move first and then they can move. And I think they also think that there isn't much money in suing them. Like, who's going to sue them for allowing some man to use the women's toilets? Like, women can crowdfund, sure, but you don't get your costs back in the employment tribunal. Women can't do this all over the country. There's long waits in the employment tribunal. I think they're making a risk assessment, a lot of them, that if they go in line with the law, they'll get attacked on social media, they'll be dragged by Stonewall and the rest across the world, they'll become a big news story even maybe. They'll have people threatening all sorts, self-harm and things, on TikTok. So, yeah, lots of reasons to do nothing and requires some leadership and bravery to do something.
And what do you make of this thing about, we're waiting for the EHRC guidance? Is that, presumably you don't recommend that approach because the clarification is effective immediately. But what do you make of that as a strategy? What will that guidance even look like? And when is it likely to be published? It's like as if people are thinking it's going to be kind of in the summer, but I gather it might not be until the autumn. Is that right?
Yeah, and anyway, it's not the law. So to explain what it is, the EHRC is the owner of the Equality Act. It's the regulator of it. Its job is to make sure that it's enforced and upheld. And it produces guidance, which gives loads and loads and loads of examples to help people, employers, service providers, etc., if they're ever in a spot of difficulty. And not just about sex, about all the protected characteristics. However, this isn't the law. This is guidance, statutory guidance, sure, on how to uphold the law. It's intended for people who don't have general counsel and the like. And the idea that you have to wait for that to understand that sex is biological, 3 words, that's what the Supreme Court you could literally sum up that 88 pages as sex is biological. The idea you've got to wait for that is insane. However, like I say, it's insane. It's not actually insane. It's pretty smart if what you're trying to do is make sure that other people move first. So it just became the thing to say. Everybody's just saying it. The Scottish Government said it, for goodness sake. Like, they have an entire legal department. They literally said on a call with us and other stakeholders, other women, a couple of weeks ago, that the EHRC had told them to wait for the guidance. The idea that the EHRC had told a government to wait for guidance intended for small service providers. The EHRC, needless to say, has said no such thing. And we've written a letter before action to the Scottish Government, by the way, telling them to get the finger out.
So I'm wondering if it might just be a stalling tactic.
Oh, more than that. It's not even just stalling. It's just let someone else get the heat. Let someone else move first.
And what do you think the risks are from making those allyship statements? I mean, they seem pretty unwise to me. I'm not a lawyer, but they seem pretty unwise to me, if only because you're not thinking about any of your staff who actually might be quite pleased about the ruling. It seems very kind of one-sided, and Inji can talk about this a little bit more. But are there legal reasons why it's unwise to make that sort of statement as well?
Absolutely. And I mean, it can be summed up with what the Supreme Court said. We caution that this is not a triumph of one group over another. Yet, yes, this is unwelcome news for people with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. Employers need to understand and acknowledge that. But it'll be very welcome news for people with gender-critical views. It'll be welcome just for ordinary women who want to know that they can have single-sex spaces in the workplace, and that, they don't have to pretend that men can be women if that's not something they want to do. And there's lots of people it'll be welcome for. We know from opinion polls that most people think that your sex is your biology, not your identity. Most people think that men who identify as women shouldn't be in women's spaces, shouldn't be in women's sports, shouldn't count for women as women for any legal purposes. And in fact, that the group of people who think that is increasing. So by saying this, employers are pretty much automatically setting themselves against a large group of their staff, and very possibly a large majority of their staff. So, I mean, that's, not a great idea for morale in the first place. And it does make you look like a bit of a scofflaw to do such a thing. And that's not a great idea either. Like, one of the things employers should be doing, if they're wise, is giving a strong impression that they care a great deal about the law, about legal compliance, about being good corporate citizens and so on. And then there's a legal risk that if any of your female staff or any of your gender critical staff, in case people aren't familiar with that term, it's just a fancy way of saying people who think that sex is biology, not identity. If any of them take you to employment tribunal, you can be absolutely certain that those communications will appear in the evidence bundle. And they will be evidence that you are biased against all of your staff who hold that belief. It'll make it more likely that you lose, and it'll make it more likely that you pay aggravated damages.
I should just say that for anyone who's new to looking at this topic from an HR perspective, I highly recommend our previous episodes with Kate Barker, Stella O'Malley, Kelly J. Keane, and Helen's colleague Maya Forstatter, to sort of catch you up on some of the background to that and who the alternative voices are that we haven't been hearing enough of from an employer perspective. Thank you so much, Helen. That's really helpful.
Tanya, if I could just say one more thing in response to this. We've been thinking a lot about this, about the way that employers should communicate with customers and with staff. And we think the best model is a product recall. So when a company puts out a product, it did its best. Unfortunately, the product was contaminated or there was some problem with it. You don't sidle it off the shelves. You don't pretend it didn't happen. You don't brush it under the carpet. And you don't send out emails that are self-aggrandizing about how wonderful you are, and then a little bit at the end about how unfortunately. I actually looked up the last product recall I got when we thought of this metaphor, and I think it was from Holland and Barrett. And it was just so clear, like it started product recall, name of product, we are taking this off the shelves. If you brought it, bring it back. This is why. Do not worry. You will get a refund. We are very sorry. So clear. Like, that's the way you've got to write. You have to say our previous policy was wrong. We based it on the best advice that we had at the time. The Supreme Court judgment shows that was wrong. It is now our legal obligation to change it. This is the new policy. You can acknowledge that that's unwelcome for certain groups. Of course you should. You communicate there and then to staff who are now going to change what they do. Like, you say really clearly, we do not tolerate bullying or harassment. People who identify as trans and anyone else who's uncomfortable with using spaces for their own sex, there are unisex options. We have checked our signage. We are sure we are accommodating everybody. But you don't talk like one group is important and another group isn't. It's the law. You wouldn't do this if the tax code changed. Treat it the same way as the tax code changing.
Okay, some great tips there. Thank you so much. I'm going to move over to Inji. A lot of people who've been watching this issue unfold are very aware of all the bad practice out there and the number of HR professionals who seem to have completely lost their way with this. But you're an HR director who realised quite early on that something wasn't right here, and you've managed to sort of keep your head throughout some pretty strange days. Staying with the present for a moment, we'll get into the detail in a second about how this unfolded. But overall, what have been your kind of headline reflections on how you've seen employers respond to the Supreme Court ruling? Have you been surprised by what we've just described here?
Not by most of it. I tend to agree with Helen around there's probably not a win in it for most employers to kind of go first. That might sound kind of cynical. And it is absolutely part of HR's responsibility to make sure that the law is being complied with. I suspect a lot of companies are just quietly getting on with it. And some have made that statement about they're waiting for the full guidance. What the EHRC have provided so far is an interim statement. I don't think it's guidance. I have been surprised, though, by the organisations that have come out and the individuals who have come out and said, we're not going to follow the law. We disagree with it and we're not going to follow it. And I do find that extremely surprising. They might have said, well, we disagree with the law and therefore we're throwing the weight of our organisation behind lobbying Parliament on it. Again, depending on your organisation, that may or may not be an appropriate thing to do or a smart thing to do. But to just say that we don't like this law and we're not going to follow it is an extraordinary statement to make. And I can't think in my, as you delightfully said in my introduction, over a quarter of a century of doing this stuff, I can't think of another one where organisations have just said, no, we don't like this and we're not going to follow it. So I have been surprised by that. And I feel like if you are, in any position of responsibility, in any leadership role, not just HR, that is a dereliction of your duty to the organisation. Your duty is to keep the organisation safe and legal.
Mm-hmm. So to understand how and why employers are behaving this way now, I think we need to go back in time. So you were working as an HR director at a big UK supermarket when trans inclusion, as we've been calling it, came in. What were your memories of when and how this was introduced to employers, and why wasn't it properly scrutinised at the time? Would you say it was 2017, 2018 that it first was on your radar?
It was probably on my radar earlier than that, but it really kind of gained momentum, I want to say, kind of 2017 onwards. I think it kind of took hold through a number of routes. So, inclusion, diversity, inclusion, equality, whatever badge you want to give it, has taken a bigger and bigger corporate agenda. Some of that, I think, is driven by institutional investors, particularly US-based institutional investors. There's boxes you have to tick, ESG boxes, environmental, social and governance boxes, that you have to tick if they invest in your company. And I think, the kind of the LGBT stuff is quite an easy way to do that. It's quite low cost, it's quite low effort. I think a number of organisations know they were slow on gay rights specifically. And kind of getting behind Stonewall, which has that brand, and doing their equality index has been kind of, again, a relatively easy way to remedy some of that, to signal that you're an inclusive employer. It stands as a proxy for other things as well, which I know isn't necessarily true, but I think is a perception. Or if we, if we've got the rainbow badge, well, people will know we're not racist either, and we're not sexist, and actually none of that is true. But I think there's a perception. Helen talked about kind of Stonewall have been massively influential in disseminating incorrect information. And I'm actually aware that kind of prior to the incorrect information, they were campaigning to have those single sex exemptions under the Equality Act removed. Helen, I don't know, I'm sure you're aware of that. Which is really alarming. What we're talking about there are, things like rape crisis centres and prisons and sports like boxing, which get that exemption under the Equality Act, which I think very few people would feel it's appropriate for those to be mixed sex. And when they failed in that, they did this brilliant sleight of hand, which was just to tell everybody that this is how the law operates, and why wouldn't you believe them? They also had their equality index, which you got marked down on if you didn't allow people to use the facilities of their choice, if you used heinous words like mother in your maternity policy. I keep going, God, when you understand the root of the word maternity, it's going to blow your mind. And I think as far as, this concept, in HR of kind of best practice, it just proliferated. I remember, my team giving me kind of, an updates maternity policy, and this phrase birthing parent had crept in. Like, absolutely not. We are not using that. So it's been very, very effective, very clever. And it's just become the accepted truth. I remember when you had Neil Morrison on this before, and he was talking about kind of how few HR people actually understand the law. And I think that's part of the root of it is, I was trained very thoroughly in the law. And so while I am not a lawyer and would never claim to be, I have a good working understanding of the Equality Act and the 1992 workplace regulations. And it seems to me that if anybody had spent any time reading that, they would have gone, well, self-ID can't possibly be lawful. But, so many law firms got it wrong as well. I don't think you can just kind of lay the blame at the feet of HR. You go to very big name law firms and they absolutely told you, no, if you've got, a male employee who says he identifies as a woman, you have to let him use those facilities now. And if any women complain, you have to shuffle them off somewhere else or take them to, a re-education camp so they learn not to be a bigot. So it has been quite an odd place to be for a number of years, quite a lonely place to be saying, I don't believe that's legally correct or actually the right thing for the workplace.
Was it scrutinised at all? I mean, it doesn't seem like there was really much or indeed any kind of public discussion of, hang on a second, some of this sounds kind of extreme and some of it sounds like not legally compliant. Were there any private conversations between people in your network at your sort of level who were going, hang on a minute, does anyone else think some of this is a bit funny?
Not that conversation, because I've always been very public in my views on this. I've had people kind of privately contact me and say, oh, we've got this situation, what do you think? Or, actually, our lawyers are telling us this. Does that seem right? I've had people contact me after the Supreme Court ruling going, right, just break it down for me. What can we do and can't we do now? So there has been that. Equally, kind of the other day after the Supreme Court decision, I got a wonderful message from a friend of mine, HR director in another organisation, who said, you're treating myself to a celebratory coffee on the way to work because I can read the Equality Act and I don't have any work to do. I don't have to rewrite all my policies today. There's not been a win for anybody in HR to talk publicly about this, not to the same extent, as Maya and Helen and many others in this. But, I've had the attempts at cancellation. I've had people writing to my employers going, we think she's a dreadful person and she's bringing your company into disrepute and all of that stuff. But I have never been very good at holding my tongue when I think that something is wrong.
And that's the reason why I've invited you on.
I think one of the things that's always baffled me about this is you would normally expect organisations to act with a degree of self-interest and, fine, well, we'll do the nice stuff as long as it doesn't get in the way, is, typically how organisations act. But on this particular topic, they have been illogical. They have self-harmed. I was reading some kind of thoughts about the Sandy Peggy case this week. So somebody who kind of works in the NHS who went, she was an intensive care nurse with 30 years experience willing to work nights. You would expect her trust to be laying bouquets at her feet, every shift and thanking her for turning up. But they have suspended her for many months now, and at what cost to patient care and health in Fife, because she wouldn't get undressed in front of a junior doctor who was going to be rotated out in a couple of months' time. It doesn't make sense. And there's a load of examples of that, with, numerous retailers changing their changing room policy and all the rest of it. You go, this makes no commercial sense. I don't understand how this is still standing. So this doesn't behave like anything else, and it's not the normal laws of logic or self-interest don't apply. It's such a strange one.
So I guess, that question, you've probably answered it there, Inji, in terms of how did we get here? So, how did we get to a point where employers have been running a sort of unlawful self-ID policy for staff, around things like single-sex spaces and collecting data about something called gender, which no one seems to be able to define, and gender identity, which is even more difficult to define. Yes. How have we been policing the speech of staff who raise questions or concerns about any of this stuff? You mentioned Stonewall. They're not the only sort of training provider in this space. Seems to me like there's an awful lot of them that suddenly appeared, and there's no due diligence being done on who those trainers are. So I've been quite shocked at the standard of that, and that people coming in with some frankly pretty kooky ideas. And it seems to me that nobody was able to challenge that in the same way that even senior people like at your level weren't talking to each other openly. Nobody felt able to say, actually, some of this stuff's a bit much. Was that the first sign almost that something was terribly wrong here, that there was this sort of silencing kind of chilling effect that happened? I remember it coming in, and it just like that no debate thing came in at the same time as the ideas. There wasn't really a moment for anyone to say, oh my God, what? This is a bit strange. And it had kind of gone, it was so quick. Is that what you remember, that it was just really quick?
Yes, it was really quick, and that silencing was really effective really early on. So very early on, for whatever reasons, predominantly women, but actually anybody who didn't share this belief got the message very quickly. It's not safe to speak up and challenge it. So if you're subjected to some of this training at work, you're going to, at least suffer a black mark, if not actually be, sacked. If you go, hang on, I don't think that's right. And again, that was remarkably effective. I suspect through a couple of means. So some organisations actually taking action against people, typically women, who were speaking up. Stuff that was in the press. I remember a colleague coming to me and saying, I don't understand what's wrong with what J.K. Rowling has said. He said, I've read it, I don't get it. But clearly he had absorbed the message that this was terribly wrong, and he'd read, her essay and couldn't work out what was so terribly wrong about it. I went, well, there's nothing wrong with it. Nobody has been able to kind of specify anything from that. But again, this absolute truth has grown up that she's a terrible person. So again, I'm sure it'll be a cultural phenomenon that's studied in years to come about how did this happen. I think, Helen, you said that this is not a kind of an activism that likes evidence, because it tends to kind of crumble. And you see that in the reactions to the Supreme Court judgment. But again, I don't think people want to do the work of reading what was said, and they really should, because that Supreme Court judgment is, given these are like the highest judicial minds in the country, it's very readable.
Do you think there's something about generational change? I mean, we know from opinion polls that we and others have done that this is a belief system that's very much more prevalent among young people and almost not at all among older people. And that's not surprising, because we've been teaching in schools for close to 20 years now. But so young graduates or just young school leavers are coming into workplaces with this belief and very, very sure that they're right, and very sure that it's part of a suite of beliefs about, anti-racism, anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia, a certain version of feminism, and they're a package. And if you come into the workplace, you're already primed, because you've been told in school that your elders are massive bigots, super backwards, that you're there to educate them. And I mean, listen, I'm not saying that previous generations got everything right, but they are literally your superiors in work. And they're also people like your general counsel, your line manager, your CEO, your board, and they're the people that you're thinking, massive bigots, dinosaurs, they'll all die out. And in the meantime, a bit of reverse mentoring will make them understand that sex is a spectrum and that men make the best women,
Yeah, that was actually my next question, Inji, was about what happened to leadership. I mean, HR directors, CEOs, boards, why did nobody say no to particularly young people, as you say, Helen? Particularly, I think it was around the same time that the LGBT staff groups sort of did a sort of massive mission creep from being like just a jolly thing to suddenly becoming, you've just delivered the perfect place for all those graduates coming straight out of university to all get together and talk about not only what's wrong with the world, but what's wrong with this organisation. And you've given them a direct line quite often to somebody, a senior champion, who they're now kind of quite matey with in a way that also isn't normal, really. And so, I guess that's my question really is, how did leadership fail and why did nobody kind of, I'd love to bring back the phrase nip it in the bud. I think it should never have gone out and should definitely come back. We sent to, now we're doing let's see how it goes, which is definitely not as good. Why did nobody push back immediately and nip this in the bud?
I think, this point about generational being seen as dinosaurs, and, lots of people in those leadership roles are white straight men. And don't want to be seen to be on the wrong side of anything, or feel they don't know enough to challenge stuff, which again is a reason why, as a gay woman from a kind of Muslim background, I feel the need to be quite outspoken on a number of things, because it does give people permission to go, well, perhaps I don't think she's kind of homophobic. Maybe it is okay to have a conversation, and maybe I can explore this in a more sensible way. But if you are a white straight middle-aged man who is the sponsor of the LGBT network, you're just not going to have the confidence to push back on some of this stuff and question it in the same way. And I think activist staff networks have been part of pushing this, and I think you've had a kind of perfect storm of the sponsor not wanting to push back, HR perhaps not being close enough to it, or again, not kind of understanding, in various companies I've been in, things have been kind of proposed by the network, and I've been the one that's caught them. So I remember, being in an organisation, and it was just kind of, I don't think it was deliberately kind of slipped past, but again, it was, in the scale of an organisation, it's not a very big thing. And that we're going to do some work or give some money to this organisation, Diversity Role Models. That rings a bell. Can we just pause till I go and check something out? And they had recently done some work with a big supermarket. And again, you kind of go, why? Why as a supermarket would you ever think this is a good thing to do? But the supermarket had engaged them, it was COVID times, to do some kind of home learning pack for primary age children on gender issues. It might have been badged LGBT, but it was mostly around kind of gender. You go, why as a supermarket would you think that's a good thing to do? But the pack had to be withdrawn, and the chief exec at the time had to write to Baroness Nicholson and explain that he was very much against paedophilia, because some of the stuff that was in this pack, it had the slogan "Love has no age," which was, of course, the slogan of the Paedophile Information Exchange. And one of the books recommended, I think the kindest interpretation of one of the sections of this book is that it kind of sanitizes or glamorizes child sexual abuse. You could have a more unkind interpretation of it. And so I said, we're not going to work with this organisation. I'm not putting our chief exec in the position where he has to write to Baroness Nicholson and go, sorry about that. Why would we even contemplate it? But, if it hadn't been for a chance conversation, that would have gone ahead. And I don't think it's realistic to expect, busy leaders at whatever level to be as clued up as you have to be on all of these organisations and everything that's going on.
You mentioned the lawyers earlier, Inji, and I'm still confused about this. I've not yet got to the bottom of whose fault this is, because the lawyers seem to blame the employers and the employers blame the lawyers. So it seems to me like it falls between them. So I don't understand why didn't the lawyers, when this stuff first started coming in, why didn't the lawyers, usually external firms, even big firms don't tend to have their own employment lawyers in-house, as I understand. So why didn't they flag the obvious risk to their clients, especially those, for example, with changing rooms and things like that? And then also when it became clear that something was wrong, when the employment tribunals started, why didn't employers start to kind of self-correct when it was very clear there was a problem here?
So, I mean, you'd have to ask some of the law firms that gave the incorrect advice, Tanya. I can't speak for them. I can't explain it. If I, as a non-lawyer, could read the workplace regulations and the Equality Act and go, well, self-ID is definitely not a thing. The debate is whether or not a gender recognition certificate changes your sex for the purposes of this. I can offer no explanation for why huge firms didn't get that right. Now, some of them were Stonewall champions, but again, you can't imagine that you would put your professional reputation on the line for the sake of, your stamp of approval for Stonewall. Again, baffling, absolutely baffling, defies all logic and self-interest. They were, and when you kind of say, why weren't employers taking action as things started to stack up? There was very little coverage. There was very little coverage in the HR press. Most law firms, will send out a roundup of, key cases. They were very rarely in there. There was, when Maya Forstater won at the AAT, there was a little bit of coverage, but all of the coverage I saw was couched in, this isn't significant, this isn't a landmark case, this doesn't allow you to misgender with impunity, it doesn't really change anything. You're not allowed to manifest these beliefs. It was all downplayed. So again, you would have to be very sharp. You would have to take a very particular interest in this topic to know that anything was happening. And I think that leads us to the CIPD and their role in this.
Can I just say the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, which is the UK's HR industry body, was that how you would characterise it?
That is, yes, our professional body. So the CIPD, the HR industry body, when you talk about how did this happen, so they were not helpful in this. In fact, I would say they're part of the problem. So they started to use language. They stopped using the word woman. They started doing that awful thing of referring to us by kind of body parts and bodily functions. My favourite was when they referred to women as the menstruating workforce, which, as someone said, it makes it sound like that's what we're paid to do. I noticed in all of their policies, and I include People Management in this because People Management is the magazine of the CIPD. It is published, I think, by Haymarket. It doesn't really matter who, but it is their magazine. Again, men always still got to be called men. They were never called the ejaculating workforce.
Can we not start that?
Yeah, probably for the best.
Continue.
Men always still got to be referred to as men, but women were either talked about in these dehumanising ways or just talked about, kind of people or employees. And then you get this weird distortion of statistics, like, 30% of employees have had a difficult menopause. And you go, do we think that's 30% of all employees? Or is it, 30% of the 50%? But they were clearly very silent on this. They weren't covering the cases. They weren't saying, HR, you need to be paying attention to this. And then in 2023, they published their workplace guidance on trans and non-binary inclusion, which was put together with people who were lobbying from a particular agenda. I'm not sure Sex Matters existed back then, but when you look at their list of contributors, there were no women or Muslim groups or any of the other groups that we know were affected by workplace facilities were inputting to this. And in that, they said that people should be allowed to use the facilities that they felt comfortable with. And that anyone who objected to that should be, I'm trying to think of the phrase now, I think should be encouraged to use compassion or empathy, something like that. Of course, not compassion and empathy for women who don't want to get undressed in front of colleagues that they know to be male. The compassion and empathy, as ever, only goes in one direction. And I think that was really huge because, it gave a real stamp of validity to everybody's policies that had been operating like this. And I've certainly heard of law firms who were doing training on this topic who then referred to the CIPD guidance and said, well, the CIPD have said this, so you must. And it just perpetuated this whole myth, unhelpfully, I think. They have, of course, subsequently withdrawn that guidance and put out some new guidance last autumn. I couldn't tell you the date. Yeah. Interestingly, the first guidance went out with lots of fanfare, wasn't behind a paywall. New guidance was snuck out and is behind a paywall, so I still haven't seen it because I'm not a member of the CIPD. I am told it is toned down, but basically just says this is very complicated and you need to see a lawyer. I'm told it still doesn't reference the 1992 workplace regulations, which to my mind are critical in this. And to the point that you made, Helen, around, yes, the Supreme Court ruled on the Equality Act, but other legislation needs to be interpreted in the light of that. And I think it would be a bold legal position to say that, you would interpret the use of the word sex under 1992 regulations as meaning anything other than biological sex, given that I think the regulations do talk about, I can't think of the word now, but again, decency and privacy and all of that stuff.
Do you think that did that CIPD guidance just get baked straight into policy for lots of employers, particularly smaller employers?
Absolutely.
Do you think they didn't bother to get their own lawyers to check it? You think they just went for it as it was?
Why would you? It's the CIPD.
Right.
The CIPD's had lawyers check it.
Yeah.
And if I could come in there, the EHRC's guidance was very bad as well, very, very poor. So the 2011 statutory code of practice was very heavily influenced between its first draft, which was extremely simple, and, sex was sex, and what actually got published and then laid before Parliament and baked into statute, which made it sound like it was unbelievably complicated to run a single-sex service. And that, you would have to case by case decide about each individual man who said he was a woman. And how you were meant to do that, they're all men. There's not a difference between them. They're just all men. And so if you're going to let one of them in, you're going to let all of them in. And they just had this, unwarranted faith in the single-sex exceptions and the gender reassignment exceptions. And under Kishore Falconer, Baroness Falconer, they have improved a lot. But of course, and this is the second thing I would say about not just the EHRC, but every regulator and every organisation like Advance AG, the CIPD, all of these quasi-regulators that are membership bodies, who goes into these places? Who thinks that they want a job in these places? They're people who in school and in universities thought that what their job was something like social justice. And I don't mean in the ordinary sense of social justice. I hope we all want that. I mean in a very particular identitarian sense, seeing white bad, black good, man bad, woman good, cis bad, trans good. Those people actually preferentially go into organisations where what they can do is produce policies. And it's not about legal compliance for them. It's not about business costs. It's not about business sense. It's about trying to change the world by putting out guidance. And they can do it without any comeback. Like if you're the CIPD, they get by on membership fees that are not decided on the basis of any one policy. People join these organisations because you get a suite of policies or some help of some sort, some training, so that if you go to the employment tribunal, you can say you had that training. It's a whole package, and then they can kind of do not very good work. And then the same things or something similar happens with lawyers. Loads of people become lawyers because what they're interested in is human rights. And again, like human rights, fantastic. I work for a human rights organisation, but they mean a specific sort of human rights. They mean like trying to work towards utopia and going beyond the law. Like they often use that expression, we go above the law. But if you go above the law in one place, you're probably breaking the law in another way. But so there are very activist people go into these organisations. And that's what we've seen, people working in organisations with good names, trying to change the world and selling policies and advice on that basis. But the people who are buying those policies and advice don't think that's what they're buying. They think that they're buying sound business sense and actually legal advice based on the real law as it is.
I have a new spy within the CIPD who's getting in touch with me to say that lots of the people there have been there a very, very long time. They're actually older than you might think they are. There are some young ones as well, but not very many. And the culture there is very much be kind, more than that kind of activisty thing. That's the more dominant thing. And they think that they're being kind, and they've just sort of been there for too long. A lot of them have never worked anywhere else as well. And I'm a little bit nervous that actually CIPD still seem to be quite cozy with Lewis Silkin, who were the law firm who did the first guidance. So I'm a little bit concerned that even though that first guidance turned out to be very, shall we say, problematic, I think they're still knocking around in the same space. Lewis Silkin was certainly at the CIPD Festival of Work conference a few weeks ago. So I'm a little bit concerned about that. But I don't think anyone ever leaves the CIPD, Helen. I think they retire. So I wondered if it's
right.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know that either until this person came forward. But
the law firms, these large law firms, which give just very cut and paste type advice, they have large numbers of not particularly well paid, not particularly clever, frankly, youngish staff who don't know what they're talking about. I mean, my own son's sixth form put out a ridiculous trans inclusion policy. He's left school now, and it said that everybody could use whatever facilities they wanted. Trans girls are girls, trans boys are boys. Anyone who disagrees must be treated under the anti-bullying policy. Dozens of pages of this stuff. And I complained, and they actually told me that they'd gone to Eversheds, one of the biggest law firms, and they just kept coming back saying Eversheds says this is what the law says.
So coming back to the present day, let's return to the question that I asked at the start. So are organisations captured, conflicted, or just plain clueless in terms of what we're seeing now? I think the answer to that depends in part which industry or sector you're looking at, as to which of those three, and it may be a combination of those three, but which of those three is the most dominant. Helen, what do we mean when we say that an organisation or an industry is captured by these sorts of ideas? Which sectors and industries do we sort of see this the most, in your opinion?
So it's an interesting expression, isn't it? It's become very freestanding. We, like those of us who think about these topics, we say, oh, such and such is captured, and it's as if we all know what it means. But actually, it's a topic that goes back. Regulatory capture is the most worked out example of it in economics and business. So you have businesses that are regulated. So, for example, they might not be allowed to pollute the water source or something like that. So you set up a regulator to stop them from doing that, and that regulator has to give them a badge of approval or not. And straight away, what becomes the most profitable thing for the businesses to do is to target the regulator. And often the regulator is funded by the businesses that it regulates, like a levy. Over time, you chip away at the way the regulator works, and eventually the regulator is captured. That's the word that's used. And when people use that word in this context, what they mean is that a highly ideological group of people, small but very motivated, with often good charitable names from doing different sorts of work, and with a hotline to business heads, to politicians and so on, has an agenda, and that agenda is its main thing. It's what it does. I mean, I'm not saying that Stonewall regulates businesses, but it kind of does with the Diversity Champion scheme. You can see the analogy. So which industries are most captured? I mean, ones where there are lots of young people, ones where you have to attract young people. So universities are both of those. Publishing is a very bad one. Ones where there are lots of freelancers, because as a freelancer, you have fewer employment protections and your reputation is basically it. You know, you just say a word out of step and people just won't come to you again. All the creative industries, because they're, the people who are big in creative industries tend to be absolute massive fashion victims and jump on the latest fad, whatever it is. Anything where you're going to get attacked as being bad for some other reason. Like there's a reason why it's people like sort of arms manufacturers who pay for book festivals. People use these sort of good things to try to distract from. I mean, by the way, I think we need arms manufacturers. This is a dangerous world, but you know what I mean. If you're trying to sell something that gets you attacked, you say, look over here, shiny rainbow. I'm so good. I sponsor this, that, and the other. And that makes you more at risk too. And then sometimes it's just happenstance, like sometimes I've looked at organisations and I've thought, why are you so into this? And then afterwards somebody drops me a note and says, oh, their head of HR has a trans child. And that person is the person who has cascaded policies through the whole institution without anybody noticing. But the thing is, once you've done it, undoing it means admitting you were wrong. And in that case, it means admitting liability. And it means really angering people that you have said to them it's their right to do something. And so I think people just become rabbits in the headlights then. They don't know what to do. And in the end, I think some of them just want a court to tell them what to do. And, if you're in the public sector, it's not your money. You're not going to go bust. It's the taxpayers' money.
Yeah, I've seen it a lot in the charity sector as well, that their sense of sort of who they are as a person is really wrapped up in this kind of being good type thing. Actually, it's quite interesting. I don't know whether Inji would agree with me, but in the corporate world, you see a bit less of that. And I wonder if that's why the corporate world is where we're seeing the most movement, really, because I think people's sense of sort of kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, status, I guess, is based on, in the corporate world, it's based not on being kind or nice, but on kind of success. And it's based on, landing a new client or getting a promotion. I'm being a bit rude, but that sort of, it's not really about being kind. And I think that's why you're seeing them kind of probably dropping some of the stuff or moving away from it a little bit. Do you think, Helen, this podcast is popular with people who are sort of the sensible people. So the sensible HR people, the sensible kind of HR adjacent people, business people in general. If they're trying to make sense of this and work out what the hell is going on with some of their colleagues who seem to be really into this stuff, and they may only really recently have discovered how into it some of these people are, do you think they should look at those people as having like a political position, or is this something more like a religious faith?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, I think of it as a neo-religion, for sure. It is a belief system. To believe that somebody that you see outwardly is clearly a man is, in some inner sense, really a woman, is really not very far from thinking that people have immortal souls, or that people are, reincarnated, or that in some of the weirdo sort of techno-religions that they're inventing out in the Silicon Valley, that you could upload yourself to the cloud or something like that, And then the idea that other people must accept your belief. Like, beliefs do have that bad habit, especially religious ones. Like, we had to tame Christianity. Like, the Crusaders didn't say, oh, whatever floats your boat, I believe one thing, you can believe another. Like, we had to learn how to make religions coexist. So I think that religion is an excellent analogy for people in business, because we know how to tackle religion in the workplace. We understand, religion or belief is a protected characteristic. We understand that people have very different beliefs and often incompatible ones, but we've worked through how you accommodate that in the workplace. Like, you don't impose your beliefs on others. You make reasonable adjustments for people. You don't ask Jewish people to work Friday evening. You understand that your Muslim female colleagues may wish to cover their hair. You work around all of these things, and in terms of what's reasonable, what's imposing on other people, what can be accommodated in terms of your business purpose and profitability and your business needs and so on. It's just an excellent framework for thinking about people who have this unusual belief about the way humanity works, or who think that they themselves have an inner identity that's non-binary or cross-sex. That's fine. People believe all sorts of things. It's just that we accommodate it in a workplace with people who don't believe those things. And we think about everybody's rights, and we think about how to work together.
Did you want to add anything, Inji, from a kind of HR perspective? What is that kind of cognitive dissonance about, where you've got HR people who think they're doing the right thing when they're actually doing some stuff that is causing quite significant distress to some of their employees?
Well, I think Helen's spot on with the kind of the faith-based analogy, and in fact, that was the kind of metaphor analogy I used to use in the workplace when we were kind of talking about should we do X or Y? Should we be asking people to do this to show allyship? And I go, well, we don't ask people to wear a cross to show their allyship with Christian colleagues and assume that if they don't do it, then they're Christian phobic. And no one requires me to wear hijab to show, my allyship with my Muslim colleagues. So why does this topic, again, need all this performative allyship? And so I think it is a helpful lens to look through. you use the phrase cognitive dissonance there, and I think, you know, if you were to kind of ask a question that, you know, well, should we force female employees to look at a male colleague's penis? I think everyone in HR would have no trouble saying no, that's absolutely dreadful. And, you know, should it be a condition of someone's employment that they have to get undressed in front of a male colleague? No, that would be absolutely terrible. But if the male colleague declares that he is a woman, the thinking of many HR departments seems to break down. And we've seen that. We've talked a bit about Sandy Peggy. You know, we're seeing that with the case of the Darlington nurses that's going ahead. And if anybody is unclear on this, I would really strongly urge them to read the kind of the testimony of one of the nurses. It was published in the Mail on Sunday a few weeks ago. It was a really hard read. It was a really difficult read, you know, as an HR professional to read what, you know, another HR person had done to this woman who's a survivor of child sexual abuse, and how being forced to share a changing room with an intact male colleague. Let's be really clear what we're talking about here. He, because he is a he, has undertaken no transition. He talked to the nurses about how he was trying to get his girlfriend pregnant. When they stopped undressing in front of him, he badgered them about why weren't they getting undressed. And that wasn't enough for the HR function there to go, I think we've taken a wrong turn. And I find that baffling, how you can hold this knowledge that those are a bad thing, but that evaporates when someone says magic words about what they believe about themselves. And you're requiring other people to believe that as well, to their own detriment.
I think it's because it's a belief system that's been wrongly classified as something else, namely an innate personal characteristic. And so people react the wrong way. They think that if you say, I'm sorry, I know he believes he's a woman and he's entitled to believe he's a woman, but he's not entitled to make me believe that he's a woman. They think that you're being a bigot. They think that's the analogy they draw is with gay rights or with, anti-racism, instead of just like, that's how I would talk about people with any religion. I'm an atheist. And then the language, of course, doesn't help. If you started from the premise that you have to call Rose, in Inji's example, she, you can't actually explain what's happening. You know, the other women don't want her in the changing room with them. You think, like, what's wrong with those other women? Are they bigots? You know, is that like they treat a black woman or the way that they treat a lesbian or something like that? No, it's because he's not a woman at all. So the language and the misclassification not as a religion, to me, are the reason that this has all managed to happen this way. And it's fooled a lot of HR people. They just use all the wrong analogies.
The other elephant in the room, which I think you alluded to, Helen, is the role of senior leaders who are personally invested in this issue. For example, if they have a trans-identified child, especially if they as a family have chosen for that child to pursue a medical pathway, so with puberty blockers, opposite-sex hormones and surgeries. I know you've talked about this a little bit before. I don't think I've ever heard you talk about it in the workplace, though, as to why those parents will find it so difficult to see the legal, HR or business aspect clearly, because those seem like facts. And if these are sensible senior people in every other respect of their work, is it simply not possible for them to see this with clarity?
I mean, I've heard some extraordinary stories about this, absolutely extraordinary, and I've experienced some of them myself. Sometimes what happens is that the adult is in hock to their own child, and they have handed over, you used the word leadership, they've handed over all authority and leadership to their child, and they know that unless they use their company position in a way that their child approves of, their child will, for example, cut them off, refuse to speak to them. You know, there's one of the most horrible strands of trans activist, speech is about how if your parents don't agree with everything here, they're bigots and you must cut them off. So parents are often absolutely terrified. So yes, I have heard about specific examples of very senior leaders in business who have really gone all in on trans issues in the workplace as something they know they must do if their child is not to cut them off. And I mean, this is really outrageous. You wouldn't do anything else like that. I mean, you wouldn't bring any other really business and legal risk issue into work like that, but people do on this. And I think they do it again because they misclassify what's being asked, and because they're very scared about what their children will say. And then some people, some middle-aged people, are just really convinced that they are dinosaurs. Like one woman who treated me extremely badly, I heard about afterwards through an email from somebody who had worked as an intern in her office for the summer. And they said, oh, she has 5 daughters, and her daughters are all in on trans allyship. And what she said to me one day was, she said, you know, I know I'm past it. I always thought I was a feminist. I call myself a feminist. This woman was a lawyer, by the way. But my daughters tell me that I'm just don't know what I'm talking about, and I'm past it. And so, I go along with what they say. You're like, oh my God, I have more confidence in myself than that. Yeah, there's a very widespread lack of leadership here.
I recorded a previous episode with a chap called Paul Sweeney, who's a corporate strategist. It's called Are Activist CEOs Out of Control? And he said that he thinks people with a trans-identified family member should recuse themselves from discussions and decision-making relating to this issue. He thinks it should be treated like any other conflict of interest.
Yeah, I mean, I would just keep using the belief analogy. So, I mean, this is a matter of public record. For about 10 years, the editor of The Economist, John Micklethwaite, wonderful man, he's not the editor now, he's Catholic. And The Economist has had for a long time a pro-legal abortion and pro-gay marriage positions. And he was asked about that when the editor choice was being made, and he said those are the settled positions of the paper and I would not be changing them. By the way, I'm not saying I know what he believes on those issues. I just know that it was regarded as reasonable to ask somebody if they were going to be changing those positions. So I wouldn't say that someone should recuse themselves. I just think that we should treat it like a belief system. You want to be able to say to people, do you understand that gender identity ideology is a belief like other beliefs, and that if it's a belief system you personally hold, that you are not going to do anything in this workplace that goes against the law or the interests of all the many groups that are working here in service of that belief system. And someone could just say, no, I actually do think that it's bigoted to say that men can't be women, but I'll keep that belief at home.
So in terms of what we're seeing now, I mean, there's a few pretty obvious sort of theories behind why we might see employers behaving as they are. So I guess, taking bad advice from lawyers and activists, lots of activists masquerading as lawyers suddenly, which seems rather odd to me. LGBT staff groups that have got too powerful. I wonder whether maybe several employers didn't want to challenge them around Pride. Maybe they just thought, wait, maybe we'll just do it in July rather than June. I don't know. I think there's probably a lot of ineffective CEOs, as probably more than the kind of activist CEOs, to be honest, who probably just sort of left it to the HR director who might have got this one wrong. I've also been worried for a long time about this movement, and I guess lots of what people could sort of call woke, which means that lots of sensible people have actually been leaving the workforce within the last few years. And so at moments like this, you look around and see how many critical thinkers have we got left. Are those exactly the people that we got rid of by shaming them and shouting them down? They've all left, and you've kind of got all your nodding dogs are still there. But actually, this is the kind of moment when you're really going to miss having those sensible people. And even if they are still there, I wonder whether in some of these places, the culture is still too oppressive for people to feel that they can challenge the dominant view. Lots of heads of DEI, those that are still in place, and some of them have rebranded themselves slightly, they're quite powerful and they're quite domineering. Quite often they're male, actually. I think sometimes this industry is mischaracterized as being lots of sort of be kind ladies or lots of young women. But actually what I see is the heads of DEI now, particularly in big firms, tend to be gay men, middle-aged gay men who are really, really into this sort of stuff. Actually, that brings me on to another question, which is quite a lot of what we're seeing at the moment actually about messaging. And I'm wondering whether there's more conflict going on behind the scenes than it might look like from the outside. I'm wondering if this is possibly the first time in lots of organizations that they've really had to sit down and actually look at this properly, and whether they've suddenly realized that a lot of people are really into this. Some people were never into it. And the people that were not into it have now feel they've got a little bit more space to say, well, actually, this is the law, and actually women's rights, and actually LGBT rights. And some people aren't really into this trans stuff. And I'm not sure about some of these partners that we're using. The puberty blocker stuff is all wrong suddenly after the catastrophe review. I think there's a particularly high level of groupthink within DEI and marketing. I think marketing actually has been really important within this. The marketing departments, I think they understand this, but they don't. But actually, in some parts of HR do remain able to see this clearly. I think lots of recruitment people have always been able to see this clearly. Lots haven't, but lots have. So I think it's not necessarily the case that everyone's really into this. And I think other parts of the business were never into this stuff in the first place. So the sort of sales teams, then they probably weren't the people that actually did the sort of client work typically. You've got more of a sort of socially diverse and politically diverse kind of crowd there. Plenty of Brexiteers, plenty of Trump and Elon Musk fans in the corporate world. So that you're probably going to see a lot more of those sorts of voices suddenly piping up. And I'm wondering if you're going to see quite a lot of clashes. But, well, we won't see them from the outside, but if you see them from the inside. So, for example, in May, the law firm Clifford Chance hosted a live recording of the trans affirmative podcast Queer AF. I don't know if you ladies are familiar with this.
Tragically not.
I don't, yes. If you're into that kind of thing, you'll love it. If you're not, then you definitely won't. So the audience was Clifford Chance staff, including their global head of DEI, who's a guy called Tiernan Brady, who's quite a big name in corporate DEI. And he's quite a vocal champion of what I expect he would call trans rights. Now, during the recording of that episode, a trans influencer called Abigail Thorne can be heard saying, and this is in reference to the Supreme Court judges, I'm going to swear, so here's your trigger warning. So this person, Abigail Thorne, said, "These people are fucking idiots," which is then followed by laughter, right? So we've got a whole room full of people.
Of the Supreme Court?
Yes, we've got a whole room full of people at Clifford Chance laughing at the Supreme Court judges being called fucking idiots. A little bit later on, Thorne says, "I know it's very serious to question the Supreme Court, but I'm going to do it anyway." And that's followed by applause. This is at Clifford Chance's head office in Canary Wharf. Now, I know I just dropped the F-bomb, but I didn't want to sanitize what was said because I think it's really shocking, and I'm guessing you guys do too. I'm guessing anyone listening to this podcast thinks it's pretty shocking too. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious to me that is not Clifford, as a statement Clifford Chance would want to put out for themselves, that's their view of the judges. This chap Tiernan Brady doesn't seem to have challenged what was said. I didn't hear it in the recording, and clearly he didn't ask for the podcast not to use that bit in the episode that went out. So did he even realise this was that was a bit out of? I mean, I was going to say off key, but I think out of control is reasonable description of it. Or did he think it was fine? I don't think that's a great sign. He's really, really senior. So either way, I'd be very surprised if this was Clifford Chance's official position on the Supreme Court ruling. I don't think they've actually made any sort of statement yet. I don't think they've rainbowed their logo this year either. So I'm wondering if some of the confusion, I guess, is that we're seeing from the outside is actually reflective of the genuine confusion of the people who are working within these organisations and people who've seemed to become kind of got an outsized sense of power within these organisations. I sort of feel like there might be some explosive conversations happening behind closed doors that we're just not hearing. Inji, what do you think about my theory? Do you think that there might be a lot more going on behind the scenes?
I think it will depend on the organisation. I don't think we can kind of make a sweeping statement. I suspect in some organisations that there is, and there will be some discussion around if they've managed to find themselves on the wrong side of the Supreme Court ruling, how did we get here and how do we reverse this now? I was talking to someone the other day who's a very senior general counsel for a private organisation. And she was saying to me, again, her continued bafflement. We were talking about the judgment and how clear it was. But again, in a very big law firm that she works with, and somebody from there had tried to say to her, "Oh, it's very complicated, isn't it, with regards to the Supreme Court?" And she went, "No, it isn't. You're making yourself look absolutely ridiculous. If you were telling me that you have found that judgment complicated, then I'm worried about your ability." Whether that's kind of a code and people are kind of going, "Oh, it's really complicated, isn't it?" No, it's not complicated. I do find it extraordinary that a firm the size of Clifford Chance would have a room full, presumably, of lawyers, laughing at that statement, and that they would put out this podcast, hosted by them, and nobody in that organisation went, "We should just clip that bit. That's not going to look right."
I mean, just the name of Queer AF. Like,
Don't.
why would you have a recording at work of a podcast like that? And Abigail Thorne is a popular YouTuber. He was a philosopher. I don't know if he still counts as a philosopher. I mean, I just don't know why you would do it. Like, I think there's too many people who are in non-core jobs trying to justify their existence.
Absolutely.
I mean, too many people trying to justify their jobs. I mean, I think that's going to be a big problem as we try to scale back on this. There's a lot of people who made their living
Absolutely.
out of enforcing trans ideology in the workplace on other people. And they're not going to just give up and go away.
No. And you're seeing the loudest howls from them about how outrageous this all is. And you can see a very clear correlation between people whose income depends on this being a thing and the people who are most outraged and most vocally outraged.
I've been looking at some of what we're seeing for Pride. Many fewer big brands have rainbowed their logo this year, and we've also seen a lot returning to using the original Pride flag rather than the Progress one, which includes the trans colours, which I have to say is a very neat solution if I was trying to distance myself from this stuff without getting rid of supporting Pride or LGBT at all. I think it's a very neat solution. I think it's actually a very corporate thing to do. We've also seen much less visible corporate sponsorship than last year. And actually the gender diversity trainers who are on LinkedIn expressing a lot of disappointment about the lack of support from corporations this year. I also saw Simon Blake, who's the CEO of Stonewall, described Pride as remarkably monochrome this year. So if he's noticed it too, I think that's telling us something. I've been comparing the corporate sponsorship of Pride in London for 2024 and 2025, and several big names have dropped off the list this year. So Starling Bank, PlayStation, Just Eat, NBC Universal have all dropped off that list. Also, do you remember that event last year where David Tennant was really rude about Kemi Badenoch? It was the British LGBT Awards. So their 2025 event was last Friday, and almost all of the big name sponsors had vanished. So HSBC had gone, Legal & General, Just Eat, Moet, the champagne company, National Grid had all gone. This year it was just Tesco. And also there was no David Tennant. There was no Catherine Ryan. The biggest star that turned up in person was H from Steps. So I think conversations are definitely happening. And it may be that those were just around kind of budgets and kind of visibility in terms of marketing and sort of priorities in terms of spend. But my sense kind of is that depending on the company and how many sensible commercial people are still there and whether the culture allows them to say what's on their mind, it's likely to me that those conversations about pride and spend have extended into broader discussions about whether their brand should step away from some of the more extreme aspects of this movement entirely, and some, frankly, of the rather unreliable characters who they found themselves working with in terms of the activist groups. I would hope that would mean that they would also be turning their attention to the Supreme Court ruling and making those changes. They will never announce, oh my God, we really screwed this up. How could we have made such a mess of it? They were never going to do that. But I would hope that they will rectify it. I don't know. I think we should probably wrap up. But I guess, Helen, what are your sort of predictions from here? And how do you think enforcement will work if organisations fail to grasp the nettle? What's your recommendations for employees to challenge their employers if they still aren't getting it right?
It's really difficult, isn't it? Because you don't want to pick a fight over this. And in particular, if there's a way that you can work around it personally, there may be a man who's using the women's toilets in your workplace, but maybe they're not the only women's toilets and you can go somewhere else. Like, that's the sort of thing that women have been doing for the last number of years. They've been working around it when they have to. It's not fair and it's not right. But the thing that the employment lawyers I know say is it's almost always better to have a good job than even the best employment tribunal case. That said, you can write politely to your employer and you can point to the sorts of materials that we have on our website and say, I think we've got this policy wrong. Could I ask that you look at it again? And you can play that out. If you're a member of a union, one of the great things about a union is the union can't sack you. So you can be much harder line with your union. You can turn to your union and say, I've tried my best to sort this policy out at work and I'm not getting any traction. I'm getting told to wait for the EHRC guidance, or I'm being told to wait for Advance HE or the CIPD or whoever. I want you to act for me, and maybe you and several women can do that together. And it doesn't have to just be women, but it mostly is women. And the unions have all been pretty captured too. But a case against a union now, that's a much easier case to take because you're not arguing with your employer. You can just keep sailing on at work. And then we think at Sex Matters, we think that what we need to do is to influence very strategic points. So that's why we've written a letter before action to the Scottish Government, and we've written a letter before action to the Hampstead Ladies Pond as well, because it's one of the most iconic situations in the country where we've got the situation that you should have, which is male, female, and mixed sex. There's really no reason to let any men into the women's pond because there's a mixed sex pond. They don't have to go and use the men's. And yet it's running a self-ID policy. So we've sent a letter before action to them. We're trying to talk very intensively to regulators and quasi-regulators, the people who influence entire sectors like NHS Confederation and Advance HE. Individuals can, of course, do that too. You can, if you do put a complaint in the workplace and you get nowhere, write to the HSE or your council. We have guidance on our website about how to work out which regulates your industry and your company, but one of them will, Health and Safety Executive or your local council. And CC it to the EHRC as well. Why not? I mean, this will work out. It will happen, but it'll happen faster if individuals are taking sensible steps. Don't be rude. Don't get cross. Just be politely persistent. Don't put your job at risk. I don't know how many times I've said that to people. Do not put your job at risk. When I'm introducing my colleague Moya Forstatter at events, I always say, don't lose your job. She's done that. You don't need to do it again. Yeah. So, we'll help. Other people will help. The HRC guidance will come out sometime. Somebody somewhere will finally snap and show some leadership, and then maybe some other people will follow. That's my prediction.
I think the two things I would add to that. So one is, again, just to kind of clarify for listeners, Helen's kind of talked about writing to the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, presumably because the 1992 workplace regulations are health and safety regulations. They are not employment regulation. And therefore they operate under criminal law, not civil law. Which ought to be clarifying the minds of the directors who are legally accountable for this. I've always found it in my career quite a helpful thing to remind people of. If anybody is harmed while this policy is not in place or incorrectly in place, there's a personal liability for that under health and safety law. The other thing I would add is that most companies of any size will have a whistleblowing line, which you can do anonymously, and whistleblowing complaints are typically looked at a pretty senior level. So you can do it anonymously, and it will actually typically goes to kind of like a risk and audit function. And there's usually some monitoring and tracking of those. So that can be an effective way as well, particularly if they get kind of more than one complaint on the same issue.
And Inji, my last question for you is, will the publication of the EHRC guidance be the moment when dithering organisations find they've kind of run out of time and excuses for not sorting this out? And if an HR professional is working for an organisation that refuses to get this right, what have you got any advice for what they should do?
Certainly all the organisations that say they're waiting for the guidance, they will run out of road at that point, whether they'll say at that point they're waiting for the CIPD guidance or something else. However, just to reiterate the point, the law is the law from the 16th of April. People who are waiting for guidance are acting unlawfully and possibly illegally. So I wouldn't suggest that anybody does that, but I do understand why some might be kind of using that as a cloak on the basis that they're unlikely to be sued in the meantime. If you're an HR person in an organisation that is resisting, kind of all logic and all law and all legal compliance, you have a choice to make. About what do you stand for and what are you prepared to be associated with? And if you can't change it, can you live with it? And are you prepared to condone it? I think we've talked there about some routes that you might take, that not only in the workplace is this civil law, it is criminal law as well, and directors will have a responsibility and a liability for that. And boards or whatever kind of governance body that you have should be mindful of that as well. But if ultimately they've dug themselves into a position that they're simply not going to backtrack from, make your choice. There's other jobs.
Well, All right, brilliant. Helen, any final parting words? Have you found this a useful conversation?
Extremely useful. It's given me a lot to think about. I mean, my final thought would be that business leaders should remember what they do know in other respects, which is that when you signal that you are non-compliant in one way, or that you are willing to bend the rules in one way, that very quickly cascades across your entire organization. So if an organization knows that, corners are cut on the subject of how you deal with certain things for tax purposes, or that people who are selling abroad are able to give small amounts of cash as bribes, even though that's not legal, or that, a really good salesperson who happens to be pretty handsy with his female colleagues gets away with it because his numbers are so good, very quickly you will end up with a pretty lawless organization, and you will find that other things slip too. You'll find that there's more sexual harassment. You will find that there's more financial wrongdoing. More people think that it's acceptable to fiddle on their expenses, etc., etc. And then you're going to have the devil of a job trying to get back what should have been your corporate culture. So now that this is the law and it's really clear, if you don't act on this, you're signaling to your entire workforce that you think that you're above the law, that you think that when the law is hard to obey because you have got yourself painted into a corner, that you're not going to do anything, and you are playing with fire here. I think I'd add cornered to your list of 3 C's. I think there's people who feel cornered. There's people who don't know how to get out of this. But, the longer you stay there, the harder it's going to be to get back your corporate ethics, basically.
Well, they're going to have to figure out how to uncorner themselves then, aren't they? I think that's the key message. Thank you both so much for your time today. I think this has been a really productive conversation, so I really appreciate your time. Thank you again.
Thank you for setting it up.
Thank you. That was really, really useful for me. Lots to think about. I'm going to be listening back to it and taking notes.